if you're training for a 10K and you're doing 5 hour zone two, like bike rides, like you're missing the point. And maybe you've missed the boat to start increasing intensity by quite a bit. But as long as you're in the realm of what makes sense for what you're doing, I think a good general rule is to extend first and then make more intense. And that can carry over to like the interval runs too. If you're at the point where maybe you're doing like 4 mile repeats at, maybe somewhere between your marathon and half marathon race pace, then I think, it helps to sometimes bump that up, maybe work up to 5 or 6. And if you're competing in a longer, lower impact event like you're cycling, you can even get up to like 10 by 10 or something at sort of like what would be a 2 to 3 hour max effort. So I think extending first is the most important before spending too much time increasing the intensity.
Hey everyone, if you like the Fitness Daily, just know that it's brought to you by Zor Fitness. At Zor Fitness, we offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for athletes and coaches. You can find it all in one place, zorfitness.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Fitness Daily. Today I have Blaine Lints. Blaine has a pretty awesome backstory. He's a really smart guy, hybrid athlete, triathlete, current PhD student, former Navy SEAL. I'm going to have Blaine take the floor to give his background because there's a lot to it, more than what I can say.
Sweet. Yeah, in high school, I started with some endurance sports, ended up getting into ultra distance running because I just wanted to be the best at something. And it was an area that I don't think many 16-year-olds or younger focus on. So I learned that the American record for the 24-hour run was 111 miles, and I was like, I can beat that. So I went around just telling people and like got on the news saying I'm going to run 130 miles in 24 hours, and I didn't do that. I ran 113 and a quarter. It was still a world best. And I ran 100 miles and in 18 hours and 26 minutes, which was also a junior world best. And as I was preparing for that, I got put in touch with a Navy SEAL who owned a CrossFit gym, who mentored me for quite a while and like put a ton of time into me, preparing me for buds. And that became my sole focus through senior year of high school. As soon as I turned 18, I went to the first available boot camp class with a SEAL contract, went to buds, went straight through the entire pipeline with class 294 with no hiccups. Got to SEAL Team 5 in 2013, and I spent 2 deployment cycles there where first deployment, I deployed to various countries in the Middle East, and then the second deployment was to Iraq for the Battle of Mosul at the end of October 2016 to early 2017. While I was doing that, I knew I didn't want to stay in the SEAL teams forever, so I did an online bachelor's degree. The Navy offers an accelerated 1 year bachelor's for SEALs in organizational leadership. So goofy degree, but it is accredited. And I got it taken care of with tuition assistance in a year, got to save my whole GI Bill. And then once I got out, I ended up doing executive protection for some extremely high net worth families, and also started working for a privately funded international disaster response organization, which was funded by one of the members of one of those families. Worked in the management there and did the executive protection work for most of about 3 to 4 more years, and learned about the CSCS because I was asking about like certifications and what I could do to educate myself to start getting a little bit more serious and credible with coaching and understanding exercise. So bought the CSCS book from the NSCA. Really spoke to me. I just read through it and was able to take the test 2 weeks later. And that was the first time I'd ever felt like I'd learned anything that easily. I was like, oh, it all just makes sense. Like I never heard of the Krebs cycle, but like it's what I was already thinking about in my head. So it's super awesome. Got super excited about it and immediately applied to the master's program at George Washington University in exercise science. Towards the end of that, I had always known I wanted to do a PhD in exercise after I learned that you could study exercise, but found the University of South Carolina, the sports science lab, which is run by Dr. Sean Arendt, who's now my mentor, seemed like a really good fit just because they were doing research that was funded by DoD and SOCOM. Um, so that was an easy decision to make. Ended up going to South Carolina, and now I've been here for a little over 3 years. I'm in my fourth year as a PhD student here. Um, and in the last 2 years, 2.5 years, started wanting to pursue triathlon. And so I've done two full Ironmans, two half Ironmans. Last year, I qualified to turn pro at Ironman Chattanooga, so I'm now a pro triathlete, but not a very good one. And took a little break from structured training after that for a while, and have my first race coming up in 3 weeks.
That's insane. And I remember you in the so background information for the audience. I heard of Blaine because last year I attended a virtual conference for sports science held by the NSCA, National Strength and Conditioning Association. So they held this sports science virtual conference, and Blaine was one of the speakers, and he talked about considerations for the elite endurance athlete. And in his introduction and the PowerPoint slide, he had pictures of him. I think it was completing Ironman or some ultra marathon. And
Yeah, I
he
had a bunch of
just,
photos in there.
yeah. And it's just, I remember seeing the photos and it's like, this dude's jacked. Like, this dude is like, he's doing these crazy endurance events, but he's like super strong as well. And I think you mentioned that you held the Navy SEAL deadlift record as well.
Yeah, it's no longer the record, but I think after I broke it, and a bunch of people started doing it, and part of the reason I had it was probably just not as many people were going for it. I think it's like fifth now. But yeah, that was 640 pounds, and that was in 2017. It was like in the 6 months as I was getting out.
Yeah. So it's pretty insane. So that's where I'm sure a lot of people have been hearing the term hybrid athlete, hybrid training. Definitely Blaine is someone who embodies that and kind of shows that you can train both ends of the spectrum. You can, go that super endurance route while also gaining muscle mass and strength concurrent. Um, yeah, no, that's super awesome. And so you have a triathlon coming up. You said in 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's gonna be 3 weeks from tomorrow.
And how do you balance the mixture of being a PhD student and training? Because I know, especially with something like a triathlon, like it's a heavy training load. It's not just like 30 minutes a day, an hour a day. There's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah, it's pretty exhausting, honestly. It's not super sustainable. After I qualified to turn pro last September at Ironman Chattanooga, um, I was pretty like I knew I kind of like achieved my goal with triathlon, which was to turn pro because I want to see if I was like good enough to turn pro in anything. And I thought that I was. It just how long was it going to take? But I was pretty blown out after that. So I ended up kind of took like 9 months off specifically training for triathlon and just like doing a bunch of stuff just to stay in shape, but like train for a marathon in there to run with a buddy that I coach here. Um, but yeah, it's pretty tough to balance. And right now my training volume's pretty low. I usually get about 10 to 12 hours a week. So I mean, yeah, it's definitely not gonna allow for you know, a peak potential performance, but it's gonna get me close. I just have to be very specific and targeted with what I do in those 10 to 12 hours. because yeah, school's definitely the bigger priority, and that takes a lot of time too and a lot of mental energy. So yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just curious because just to compare it from my experience right now going through a PhD, how many it's for you, I'm assuming it's a full-time job essentially. You're in the lab doing research for most of the day?
Yep. So the way our program's kind of structured is we are advised to start with a lower course load, and those courses are like spread out through like 2 years or maybe even more. I finished my required course load in the first year just to get it out of the way, and then for the next 3 semesters, I think I was just taking extra classes that I thought might be interesting. Um, but yeah. Anyways, sorry, I have some issues, so sometimes I lose my train of thought a little bit.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Brain fog. Uh, um, yeah, so what is your research on right now? Like, what are you guys focusing on in the lab?
Um, so currently we're doing a study using a respiratory muscle training device, and we're also doing a like, a HIF, a high intensity functional training study. Uh, It's a 10-week study where we have participants either doing just traditional resistance training with some sort of high intensity interval training at the end, or a initial strength piece, and then something similar to a CrossFit workout or just a Metcon that kind of makes up the HIFT part of the intervention. So that's a 3 times a week training intervention. We wrapped up a few months ago one of my dissertation studies, which is it was funded by Momentous, but it was a caffeine and theacrine study in a tactical population. So we were looking at how those a combination of caffeine and theacrine versus just caffeine versus a placebo affected cognition at rest, and then after what was supposed to be physically fatiguing exercise. So they did about 30 minutes of high intensity intervals with some other training worked into some other measures of cognition worked into those intervals at some points. And then afterwards, retesting the cognitive tasks and seeing if, one of those supplements would potentially improve and sustain the improvement in cognition that you can get. Because I think people are pretty familiar with caffeine being a cognitive enhancer in certain situations, but does have a lower half-life. It can come with some side effects. Um, so what we've seen is the caffeine and theacrine combination improved certain measures of cognition and reduced response variability. And actually, those improvements were sustained after the exercise, while the effects that caffeine had were then diminished. So, overall, if you were doing something that was more than like 2 hours long, there's some evidence from this study that caffeine and theacrine combination might be a better option just to sustain cognitive function a little bit longer. And if you have that intermediate exercise stress.
Okay. And you said it was caffeine and theacrine?
Yeah.
And what I've never heard of theacrine. I'm not familiar with it. Like, where do you find that? Or what
So
is
it's
it?
a caffeine derivative. It comes from this plant called I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but Camellia cuchensis. Um, it is very similar in action to caffeine. It works mechanistically similarly. It just has a longer half-life and is purported to not lead to the same habituation that comes with caffeine. I think part of that is just because you don't get as immediate of a rush. It gets used in some pre-workouts. I think I don't know if they're still incorporating it, but like the C4 Ultimate uh, blend or whatever, I think it had like 50 or 100 milligrams of theacrine in it. Uh, and I don't know what the general perception of it is, but when I've taken it, at least in pre-workout, feels like it kind of blunts the that rushiness that I want at the beginning. So even though you get like a longer lasting effect, it's not as immediately obvious to me. So I personally don't like it for like if I'm doing a gym session, but I have found some value in it during like longer endurance sessions.
Okay, very cool. And then I'm curious, like with the research that you do, has there been any like findings or anything that you've realized like, I should start implementing this in my own training? Or has anything, or has it confirmed anything that you have been doing in your training?
So I'd say most of my training, the focus for the last couple of years now has been endurance. So I still do some lifting, but um, there's less overlap in that sense. But I would say when I started getting really interested in triathlon, I it it increases my passion and excitement to learn about that thing in order to help make me better, and it ends up, I think, benefiting me academically as well. Because then I go and seek a bunch of outside resources to learn more about it, and then I can try bring that into what we're doing in the lab. Um, but I wouldn't say there's a ton that directly from the studies that we've been doing that I can transfer that outwards. Um, but I mean, a lot of that's just because my focus has been on something a little bit different the last 2 years than it has been in the past.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and now kind of going back to your training, what you've been doing or what you have done with hybrid training. I'm very curious, like, how did you get into that? Did you start off doing endurance or did you start off with strength? How did that evolve?
Okay, yeah. So it all started in middle school when I ran a 9:55 mile in PE. I was
Okay.
like, I was running as hard as I thought that I could, and I obviously was not a speedy runner. I was also a fat kid, so I was all insecure about that. And then once I got to high school PE, I had like kind of grown out of my fat phase a little bit, started like biking, had some natural talent for it, but um, I ran like a six flat mile in PE freshman year, and I was like just blown away because I never thought that I would ever run a 6 minute mile. So after that, decided that I was going to do like swim team and then cross country. And, I had already had some biking experience. So I got into triathlon a little bit. I did two half Ironmans in high school, one when I was 14 and one when I was 16. So I think at the time I was like the second youngest person to ever have done a half Ironman, but I know a lot of that's just because the age limits on who can sign up. I wanted to do a full Ironman, um, but I couldn't find one that was allowing anyone under 18 to do it. So I had this like incessant need to just try to be better at something, and I wasn't that fast at running. Like I was decent, but my fastest 5K was around, I think I ran a 3 mile in like 16:30. And then my fastest 5K was like just under 17 minutes. So I wasn't going to be running in college or anything like that. And it frustrated me because I was running so much. And obviously it might not have been the right type of training, but kept thinking like I should be able to just train more and get better. So it got kind of ridiculous where I got to the point I was running like sometimes 200-mile weeks. Just at that point, it became something else. And then I was like, okay, well, what's something else like hard that I can do that I can be good at? And then I was like, oh, there's people run for 24 hours and stuff like that. So I was like, I started just saying I was going to run 130 miles in 24 hours because that would greatly exceed the world best at the time. And ended up doing a 24-hour run at an American Cancer Society's Relay for Life. And I ran 100 miles in 18 hours and 26 minutes. And then I ran 113 and a quarter miles in the 24 hours. So I would say, yeah, things really started on the endurance side for me. Um, but as I was kind of getting ready to do that event, I had been put in touch with a SEAL who passed away last year. But he mentored me for like a year and a half, and we spent a lot of time together. And then I ended up, going to Buds, obviously, and doing that whole thing. But it wasn't until I was doing like some CrossFit and stuff. He owned a CrossFit gym. But once I got into the Navy, and was actually at a SEAL team and could like do my own workouts and stuff, I was doing a bit of CrossFit and stuff at first because that's kind of all I knew. And then ended up getting into lifting quite a bit. And I kind of started with bodybuilding just for fun on my first deployment. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm actually like kind of naturally strong. I think like I don't remember exact numbers, but I feel like I was only lifting for a couple months before I pulled 500. So I was progressing really quickly. Um, and after that deployment, just kind of started working with a powerlifting coach for a couple of years after that. So that became my focus. I was obviously still staying in shape to do my job, which requires a lot of things that aren't just strength based, but I continued to do the strength training then. But I would still say for the most part, I didn't feel like I was doing some sort of like hybrid training. I mean, to some extent, but the priority was definitely the strength stuff. Um, it wasn't really until after I was getting out of the Navy that I was like, I want to see if I can do both. And and the other thing was I just had been exclusively lifting or almost exclusively lifting for so long that I like didn't even know if I had the mental fortitude to still do something really hard. So I was like, okay, I feel like I've had some rest for some time now and I can push it again. So I signed up for a 100-mile race in Hawaii in July of 2018. And that was super hot and humid. And I did that in just under 21 hours while, still doing all the hybrid training during that. So that was kind of, I'd say, a little bit of the peak as far as like performance goes for the hybrid training. I was training for some other stuff too, and then COVID happened. And um, after coming back to actually start school in person here was when I got into triathlon.
Very cool. I was reading about you a bit, doing some research beforehand, and
Or
you did I think it was the Men's Health and Journal
Men's
magazine.
Journal, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that
That
one.
was like my 15 minutes.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. But I mean, I think they do a good job highlighting a lot of what you did. And if I'm not mistaken, the 24-hour run that you did, one of the first ones, you did that when you were pretty young, right?
Yeah, I was 16.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. And then from there evolved into everything else. So when you went into SEAL training, did you find that you were, I mean, with 24-hour runs, there's more than just the physical capacity. There's like the mental part of it as well. Do you feel like that helped you with the Navy SEAL training?
Yes. I think there's a lot of, maybe not a lot, but there's some debate around like how much running you actually need to do in preparation for a selection course like Buds. And, you mostly just do timed 4-mile runs. I think in the last month you have a timed 14-mile run, if I remember correctly. You get to do that one in shoes and shorts. But I feel like a lot of people get stress fractures in buds and overuse injuries, and I had no fear about that. I don't think anyone like shows up to buds and was like, oh, like I ran too much in preparation. So I'm glad I was skewed more towards the endurance side, and I had at least some confidence that I had run further than anyone else in the class. So there's no reason that I should have some overuse injury from just training a lot. Because even when I was doing all that running and stuff, I was such an idiot in high school. I'd like wake up in the middle of the night and go do like 2 miles of lunges around a track and then go run and then go back to bed and then, go run again in the morning. Um, just totally psychotic about it. But I was still doing stuff besides just running when I was doing that training. So I felt like I was pretty prepared. Um, the one, the one, it's pretty surprising though. Like it didn't really matter a whole ton for my performance, which I think a lot of people have a hard time believing. But some of those dudes in buds are like I thought I was tough before going, but some of those dudes are like actually tough and like they're really tough even when it's not self-motivated. I think I have an easy time pushing myself hard when it's self-motivated, but yeah, there are definitely people on a different level in that community.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's it's crazy too, because were you one of the younger people in the SEAL training? I'm assuming so.
Yeah, I turned 19 at the end of Buds actually on San Clemente Island, but I was 2 weeks older than the youngest person in the class, which is nice because they put a little bit more pressure on the youngest person, and fortunately that wasn't me, so I got out of more stuff because of that.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny. Um, so now that you've had years and years of training, going from like super long endurance work to strength stuff, dabbled in CrossFit, um, what what is something or what are like a few things that you would recommend for someone who's looking to do hybrid training? Let's say they're um an avid CrossFit goer and they're
Mhm.
like, hey, I want to transition into this hybrid training. I want to be able in hybrid, looking at it under running lens. So running and getting strong. How would you, what are some things you would recommend?
There's a lot to unpack in that, but um, some big things are starting to become a little bit more specific than whatever the CrossFit training entailed. Just because like if you're just doing CrossFit, obviously you're pushing a lot of systems kind of hard, but not to the same extent that you would get if you isolated, the strength components and the aerobic components. Um, I'm a big fan of like, zone two or just low intensity training. I think if you want to be like a good endurance athlete or even good hybrid athlete, you need to, well, you need to allocate your resources very intelligently, but you also need to train more. And it might not just be the case where you're, stacking two programs together, but you do need to train more than if you were just doing one of those things. And so I think leveraging each to assist in the other one as much as possible can be helpful. And then also accumulating volume through lower impact modes of exercise. And I don't think that's super important, especially in the beginning, because it's just a technique to increase your tolerance for a higher training volume. But doing like I'm a big fan of the air bike just because it's full body. It's like non-load bearing, but it pretty evenly distributes stress through your whole body. And it's like, I mean, I love just sitting there for a couple hours sometimes. But those are some of the things. I also think it's probably not the best idea to immediately make massive changes in your training. I'm a big fan of like manipulating like one thing at a time and just slowly transitioning over. And that's like what I would tell other people to do. But if like personally, when I get something in my head, I'm just like, no, like if like hypothetically, if I were doing CrossFit and I decide I want to do Ironman, like I'm going to stop everything CrossFit and just go like full power on the triathlon training. But I think it may not be the best option for me either. It's just what I want to do. But I also think that I have a pretty big base of training in most things, so I feel like I can make the transition pretty head on without having a ton of like overlap as I transition over.
Yeah. And for zone two, um, you know, most people are familiar with zone two. I feel like there's been a wave recently,
Yeah.
at least in social media, where it's like zone two is good for you. They've heard it in a bunch of other popular podcasts like Huberman and all that talking about zone two and like how to prescribe it. Let's say someone gets to the point where they're doing sessions that are 60 to 75 minutes of zone two on an air bike, Stairmaster, whatever. They're hitting the heart rate range. How do you progress from there? Do you do like a wave progression or do you just continuously add time?
Um, so a bunch of options for how to approach that. And yeah, the whole zone two thing I think has been, I mean, in some senses blown out of proportion. And then you have people saying, no, like, no, zone two is not important. I think I think there's so much overlap between training that if your goal isn't like peak performance for like your potential, then like I don't think this matters a whole lot. Um, but zone two is just a way to accumulate more volume when you're already doing a bunch without, accumulating too much stress that's going to negatively impact the other things. But can you re-ask the question, please?
Yeah. So, I know a lot of times there's prescriptions online for zone two, and the most common prescription is like, yeah, you're hitting this heart rate range. You start 30 minutes, start with 30 minutes, and you progressively add time over weeks, right? 30 minutes, next week go 40, blah, blah, blah. What happens when someone gets to the point where they're doing, let's say, 2 to 3 sessions a week, and it's like 60 to 75 minutes? Like, where do you go from there? Does it plateau? Do you start incorporating other methods?
Okay, yeah. Um, Really depends what their goals are. I think like nothing is inherently good or bad. It's just like what are you trying to do and like what's gonna personally I'm more interested in like performance, so it's like I care less about like what sounds fun to do or what makes you enjoy it. Like I like coaching people who are just gonna do it. Um, so it does depend on the goal, but I mean let's what is this person who's doing their Stairmaster and air bike for two longer sessions a week training for?
Yeah, let's say they're training for let's say they're trying to just build strength generally, but specifically they're training for a longer endurance event, half marathon or a marathon.
Okay. I feel like if they're at the point where they're doing that and hopefully their running frequency is getting up a bit, but I think at some point, if they're a competent enough runner, I think getting one or two higher intensity run sessions through the week um, will be helpful, and then starting to transition over to having a long run as well. Um, I think if you are training for something like a half marathon, unless you're in the really immediate phases of like transitioning from something very different, I think you can probably. I don't think you need to do much on the air bike or Stairmaster that's not just like lower intensity work just for the purpose of accumulating volume. Just because if you're new to running, like it's too much muscular stress and the chances of getting injury if you do a lot of it and you don't have a good foundation for doing it, you're more likely to get hurt or burned out. And it's also going to it's going to negatively impact your strength work quite a bit if you just jump into running too quickly.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
but anyways, to answer your question a little bit more specifically, um, I generally think, in the most general sense, extend first and then mm, intensify. There's actually the guy who coined the term like the 80-20 or polarized training, Steven Seiler. He talks about extensifying and intensifying. And I think if you're at a point where it's not completely like if you're training for a 10K and you're doing 5 hours zone two like bike rides, like you're missing the point, and maybe you've missed the boat to start increasing intensity by quite a bit. But as long as you're in the realm of what makes sense for what you're doing, I think a good general rule is to extend first and then make more intense, and that can carry over to like the interval runs too, where like I think threshold work, threshold. We can talk about that later too, because I have some thoughts about thresholds. But um, classic threshold work that's sort of a moderate to, may rise to being a higher intensity, um, relative intensity is a good way to train for something like a half marathon and a marathon. And if you're at the point where maybe you're doing like 4 mile repeats, at maybe somewhere between your marathon and half marathon race pace, then I think it helps to sometimes bump that up, maybe work up to 5 or 6. And if you're competing in a longer, lower impact event like you're cycling, you can even get up to like 10 by 10 or something at sort of like what would be a 2 to 3 hour max effort. Um, so I think extending first in the context of what you're training for is the most important before spending too much time increasing the intensity.
Yeah. Yeah. And
But that's general.
yeah, I was gonna say that resonates a lot with like strength training, right? Like a lot of times most people or most
Hmm.
coaches will go through like an accumulation phase where it's just like building that volume before they start into like putting more intensity and load on that barbell or whatever weight loaded apparatus they're using. So yeah, I like that. And
Yeah, and
so
whenever people start like, oh, well, like when people get like no one that knows anything is going to like max their deadlift every day to get stronger at deadlifting. And that's like the easiest example of like you don't necessarily train that specific in order to improve yourself. Like at some point it is necessary, but um, putting energy into what is going to build up your physiology the quickest, which may vary, but I think like, the Norwegians would say it's threshold training, doing a lot of that, and then becoming more specific as you compete. And like, Jakob Ingebrigtsen, who just broke the 3K world record on the track, he he's competing in like I think his primary events are like the 1500 up to like the 5K, but even the 5K is like I think a little bit longer than what he specializes in. But his main event's like 3.5 to under 4 minutes, but he's still doing like well over 100 miles of running a week, and he's doing these long threshold sessions that may have like something like many 2K repeats or something like that don't really seem specific at all to something shorter like the mile or 1500, but it doesn't mean that, you have to be doing like stuff that's like, oh, your 1500-meter race pace for all of your high intensity sessions. Like, I don't think it necessarily works like that, although it can.
yeah. And I kind of want you to go back on the threshold training stuff. Circle
Okay.
back to that. Yeah, like explain what threshold is and then also what your also thoughts on it if you are someone who is a fan of that or not.
Yeah. So I think all thresholds are somewhat arbitrary, right? Because there's no such thing as like a true steady state. If you don't fatigue, eventually your body will consume more and more oxygen, and it might happen extremely slowly. And in the real world, you might be limited by, structural capabilities with something like running, but there is no like actual steady state. There's always like a slow component to it, regardless of what the intensity is. And if you kept doing it long enough, it would eventually like continue to increase if you weren't limited by other things. Um, so so in that sense, there's never any like true stability. And if there's no true stability, then like what even is this threshold? But all the thresholds are just the arbitrary definitions around what is a amount of increase in like physiological work that's happening relative to a certain amount of time. So like I think like a maximal lactate steady state test is it may be the only agreed upon threshold, but all that is just not having more than something like 1 millimole increase in blood lactate over 30 to 40 minutes. So even that's like who came up with this 1 millimole increase and why is it 30 to 40 minutes? So it's still like kind of arbitrary, but we set parameters around it and we can agree that the MLSS is tested in the most, for the most part, in a certain way. So I think there's like infinite thresholds. It's just like, what do we define it as? And, we have other methods like calculating a lactate threshold by something like the Dmax method, which I think is good, but it's still determining that threshold off a mathematical formula, and it's I mean it's basically finding the point away from your lowest and highest lactate values and seeing what the speed that's furthest away from that line is to determine your like lactate and output at that lactate value. Um, so I think, yeah, it just depends what we're calling the threshold, and I think I think it's important to always think about thresholds in the context of what you're doing because there are many thresholds because it can be whatever you want. Some just have more accepted agreement around the parameters that define that threshold. But in the sense of the like Norwegian method of training where they're doing a lot of this threshold work, I'd say that's, definitely somewhere around zone 3 to 4, where it's over that zone to cut off and whether you decide that's like above fat max or whatever. Um, I think it's easy to think about it in terms of like what is a sustainable pace for something between like a 10K and a half marathon if you're a runner who is, at least fairly well trained, not like taking 4 hours to run a half marathon sort of runner.
Yeah. And so I know you've mentioned the Norwegian method of training a bit. I'm curious, or I was wondering if you can go into more detail of what that is specifically and what other methods of training is there that's have been popularized.
Okay. So first I'll say like why this is interesting to me, and then if I lose my train of thought, we'll just come back to it.
Okay.
But in the summer of 21, before as I was getting ready to move to South Carolina for the PhD, I was watching the Tokyo Olympics, which had been pushed a year on TV, and I watched the men's triathlon live. And for those who have seen it, Christian Blumenfeld was the winner, and as he's winning, they're talking about how he trains like 40 hours a week, and I was like, I've heard 30 hours or 35 hours, but like I don't hear about like anyone doing 40 hours of training a week, and like obviously a lot of it's lower intensity, but I was like, he won and he trains for 40 hours a week, and as a side thing that's interesting, he does not look like an elite endurance athlete in any sense. Um, Even though he has in some aspects, like the most impressive physiology ever. Um, but anyways, he's Norwegian. I thought it was cool, so I started like trying to listen to more about what his coach Olav Alexander Boo was saying, and what their philosophies around training are, and basically what the double threshold. It's yeah, more specifically double threshold um, style of training might be, on 2 days a week, they're doing a morning threshold session and an evening threshold session, and then having at least a full day of just low intensity work between. Um, so it's more so about consolidating the hard work to certain days and easy work to other days, and generally not doing consecutive hard days of work. And hard doesn't mean just high intensity. It could also mean a very long session that can be taxing as well. Um, but the idea is similar to what happens with polarized training, where you're not trying to do constantly moderate intensity training that's going to, you're kind of making the easy workouts a little harder than they need to be. And now you don't get the same quality and intensity out of the hard session. So you end up just kind of not stressing exactly what you want to stress. So I think the Norwegian like threshold model kind of addresses that similarly, even though there's like lots of debate on like, oh, like what's this threshold and like is it polarized or not? It's like it kind of starts like not polarized, but then as the session goes on, it becomes like higher intensity because as you get fatigued. So I still think it's very similar concept to what polarized training is. It's just uh, in order to actually do two threshold sessions a day, like more than once a week, I think you do have to be pretty well trained. And if you're a runner, that's like a ton of stress. So I don't think in running it's a particularly great model to pay attention to unless you're like really, really good. And then at that point maybe you found what works for you. But I think it works well in something like triathlon where you're doing so much. So maybe in the morning you have like a harder bike session, and then you get some rest, and in the evening you get like a threshold run session, and the next day is just all easy.
Yeah. Um, So you're training for a triathlon. Do you coach triathletes?
Um, no. Well, a little bit. I do coach, but I coach a few friends at the school, especially there are some fit guys in the ROTC program here that I train with a lot, and I give them some guidance with stuff. But formally, the people I coach are, I'd say 90% of them are in special operations, and they're either training for like like a tier one selection. A lot of guys reach out to me about stuff like that, or they're just looking to optimize their performance as an operator, to be as good as possible and maybe prioritize some specific goals they have while still being able to be like fit for the job. So most of my people that I coach are in special operations, but then I have a couple other clients who are just might be outside of that, or maybe they used to be in, or something like that.
Okay. So still with, I mean, working with operators and that population still very high caliber. Um, some I'm assuming are pretty elite, especially if they're trying to go Navy SEAL.
Um, yeah, well, I train some people that are trying to prepare for buds, but if someone's at a SEAL team and they want to go to SEAL Team 6, they have to kind of get in a similar mentality that they had when they were joining the Navy. But now it's just at a much higher level of proficiency. So you have to like regain that PST fitness, be able to do your push-ups, pull-ups, run, swim, sit-ups, and kind of bring things back in that direction. Except if you do get selected from there, then the training can be extremely variable. So you need to also be prepared for just about anything. Those are usually my favorite people to train just because they're like very motivated to do it. So they'll do just about anything that you tell them to. Um, and sometimes you give a reason, sometimes they don't like it or whatever, and then I modify it to try meet in the middle as best that I can. But um, those are probably the most enjoyable to train just because you can see like, oh, is the training actually working, or is this a compliance issue?
Yeah. I agree with that. Those are the type of people I love to work with. So like
Yeah.
um at the university I work with the triathlon team and
Mhm.
one, they're some of the greatest human beings I've ever met. Like really great group of girls, like just good humans. So there's that. But two, like you were mentioning, like very motivated. I don't have to do the whole motivating coach thing. Like they're they're hardworking and I could see whether the plan I have. I do strength coaching, so I'm not doing their triathlon
Okay.
stuff, just strength coaching. But I could see if the work that I'm doing and planning for them is working or not and make those modifications because I know they execute everything and they're motivated and they're not sandbagging anything. So it's a very
Mhm.
enjoyable team. Um, so like when you're working with a team like that or a group of people or individual who is basically at this elite level and they are motivated, what are some things that you consider for their training?
I Okay, I think when you get people who are very motivated like that, sometimes, and I don't know if this is the case for like the triathletes you work with, but in a lot of cases they might be a little too motivated, and that was like kind of the case with me. And I was told in high school that I was uncoachable because I just like had the idea in my head that more is going to be better, and at least what I think is helpful is trying to rationalize why that might not be the case and why like, oh, this should actually be an easy run. And it's pretty easy to point out if they actually fall into the example that you're trying to give. For example, like a client that I have just uh I had him do like a 7 mile easy run on Saturday, and then Monday's supposed to be like another higher intensity run workout. And so ideally he keep that run on Saturday easy enough that he's fresh and ready to perform well on Monday. But he ended up kind of running it more of a threshold run, and then he was tired on Monday. So I was like, well, that's why I wanted that run to be really easy, so you could focus on this run, because this run is going to be more specific to the goal that you have for yourself. So I try to explain that to people, and sometimes they don't even care. They just do it. But yeah, try to be mindful of like not overdoing it, and then also trying to be communicative with them about things and have them communicate with me if they feel like it's too much, and that there's no like, like I don't think they're being weak if they say that like they're beat up. Like I want them to tell me they feel beat up, because then it just adds another piece of information for me, and then potentially we can reduce the load of their training.
Yeah. You mentioned the easy run. So you prescribe someone an easy run. Is it just something that you're like, hey, run at a easy pace, or is it heart rate based? Or do you give them a pace that they should stick around?
Okay, that's another thing. So like people get obsessed with heart rates, um, but heart rates vary so much from day to day, and your heart rate at a pace or physiological work for a certain pace or like power output or whatever, can fluctuate so much day to day. So my goal with people is to get them to the point where things like heart rate and pace, um, are just different satellites to help them calibrate where their effort is at, and then understanding the purpose of that session. So if it is an easy session that's not supposed to be overly fatiguing, then I definitely want it to be, um, no higher than, what we call like zone two. Um, and so I'll give them, I'm a bigger fan of like using time in a lot of cases, like go for a 40-minute run, not like a 5 mile run, just because it helps account for that. But I give like a pretty big range of paces and just kind of say, like, depends how you feel on this day, like how beat up are you? And if you're feeling super beat up, then just like go at the slower end, or even cut the run short if you're feeling like you're so beat up that it's going to negatively impact your next workout. I think I used to be, as I was getting excited about all these different like tools you can use and help like really get more and more precise with your training. I actually started using all of that stuff less. Um, so I do less testing on myself, and almost everything is by feel. And I have a power meter on my bike, and I'm always looking at my heart rate too, but it's just additional points to help me calibrate my own effort, because ultimately, like I have my own goal for what the session is supposed to accomplish, and I know the effort and relative intensity that I want to be at in order to meet that. So um, in that case, I don't think you need a whole lot of tools, but especially with someone who's a little bit less advanced or less familiar with some of that tech, they may not have the best sense of what a certain physiological intensity is supposed to be, nor do they potentially have the understanding of why it should be at that, or stuff like that. So I think depends on the ability and competency of the athlete, but generally might give some like wide parameters, like here's the effort, the RP that I want you at. Here's a general range of paces, be somewhere in here, or try to be, unless you're like just really it's not happening. Um, yeah, and I would say I don't really ever prescribe by heart rate now. Um, I think, yeah, at least for myself, heart rate can be like so variable, for a certain effort. And I think that's like something to consider. And I think it's like good to measure heart rate, and it's good to notice what it's doing, and good to help you make a better decision about the intensity that you're training at. But I don't think, I think it's kind of weird when people say like, oh, I'm gonna go for a run at like heart rate of 145 to 150. Um, because yeah, I mean, just for me, that can be wildly different from like day to day or week to week.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you about that because I know for me, I have like a Whoop watch, so I'll have it
Mhm.
on. And I know it's not as accurate as a chest strap and all that, but I just have it on just to just get as much information as I can, but I don't live and die by it. But for me, it varies a lot, especially since I started school, like because my stress levels fluctuate so much depending on if there's a
Mhm.
test coming up or what's, you know, things that are due. And it's just insane. Like one day, a certain pace feels great and I'm staying in that like that 130, 140. And then the next week, let's say a test is coming up and like just a lot of things have piled up, like I can't get below 160 or
Mhm.
170. And it's just like insane. So I've at least I've noticed for me, like heart rate is just one thing that it just doesn't work well with me just because of the fluctuations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the only instance where I like to use a heart rate cap is I mean, maybe if the person's like very inexperienced, but in that case, then I think heart rate can be very high and not necessarily indicative of where they should be training at. But like the last 100-mile run I did, um, I think usually if I was running like a 7:30 to 8 minute pace, my heart rate would be like 130. But on that day, and with some heat and with the nerves and all that, I was running an 11-minute mile at a heart rate of 130, and my plan was to start out running a bit faster than that, but for the first like 10 miles, because making mistakes early on in a race that's 20 hours can really screw you over in the long run. So that's an instance where I might use like a heart rate cap and just say like no matter how slow it is, just stay below this, at least for the first bit, and you get a feel for it, and your body kind of levels itself out.
Yeah. And for you, do you look at anything beyond so like you said you dabble with heart rate but you don't live by it. Is there anything you look at from a day-to-day or week-to-week basis to see if you're improving in fitness or improving in any parameters that you'd want?
I've gotten more and more unscientific with all of this, especially with my own training. Um, not really. I'm always looking at the stuff. I kind of know where I should be at, but I also have pretty good memory for how like all my past workouts have gone. So I have a good sense of like what's my effort today, what's my heart rate doing, and like what's my pace at for this. Um, there are certain times where I'll have like key sessions that are very specific and they are pace based just because I have goals for what I want to do in a competition. But um, in those cases, I might, it could be like mile repeats at 6 minute pace or something that's like more specific to the half Ironman that I'm training for in 3 weeks. But I'd say I pay attention to those closely from week to week and use that as a measure of how I'm progressing. And I kind of have a sense for like how fatigue is affecting that and how life stress is affecting that. But I wouldn't say like, oh, like each week I check my HRV in the morning, So I don't really do anything super like regimented like that. I think I just every day I'm like paying attention to that stuff and I just have a feel for like what's trending.
Yeah, yeah. I think
That
that's
may
what
not
I've
work for a lot of people though.
Yeah. So I've realized that like the more people I talk to, and especially like experienced athletes or coaches, like they're all mentioning the same thing where it's like they've started with all these metrics and like as time has gone on, they've like kind of went away from those and went more to like subjective, like, how are you feeling? Like, how's the body
Yep.
feel? How's stress and all that? And it's gone more from objective data to subjective. And I think I've also done the same over the past like few years with things where it's like I like data. I have a science background, like engineer, undergrad, and all that. So it's like that's I nerd out about that stuff. But as
Mhm.
time has gone on, it's like I've gone away from that stuff and more towards like, all right, how am I feeling today? I feel like trash. Okay. Like listening more to the body. And I think I've done that too with my athletes as well.
Yeah, and in some cases, I think it's rarely do I think this, but in some cases, obviously there's a time and a place to deal with it anyways, because you may not have like the best feeling body or mind on your race day or competition day or whatever. Um, but but yeah, I think everything always comes back to your own effort. So everything else is just a tool to get more familiar with that. And obviously some people are more interested in using data or at least the perception that they're using the data to support their training. Um, and in those cases, you can be a little bit more specific with prescribing intensities. But yeah, I try to explain that the end goal is really just to use that to help like point you in the right direction of where you should be at.
All right. So the last thing I want to ask is if what someone's looking to do hybrid training,
Mhm.
what are three reasons for them to do it? And then also, if you want to add a reason or two for them not to do it. So, three
Okay.
reasons to go for it, and a few reasons, if you have any, to not go for it.
Um, well, a good reason is the reason why I kind of got into it, which was I wasn't going to be good at any one thing. Um, so I don't think there's any world where I become like a really good runner and I'm not going to be like the strongest person ever. But I was okay at both, okay at like triathlon. Um, so you can be mediocre at a bunch of things and you can be like a really good hybrid athlete.
Yeah.
So
Kind of like
that's
CrossFit
a
too.
reason to do it. Yeah. And I think some other reasons are like you do get a lot of variability in your training if you're interested in that. If you're not super, or if you're not someone who likes to be a specialist in anything, I think there's some appeal there. And I mean, a really big part of the appeal is you're just pretty prepared for just about anything. Like in like 2019 or something, I was training for this Spartan race that the CEO of that humanitarian aid organization wanted me to do to so we could beat one of the other companies that were involved under our donor. And I had just been training for a 50 mile at the time, and I was lifting, and that 50 mile ended up getting canceled on the day before because of COVID. But um, hopped into this 5K like stadium Spartan race and got like eighth out of over 4,000. And while waiting for a friend to finish, and I was like, oh, cool. Like, I haven't been doing anything like CrossFit or any of this stuff. And like, I'm still performing well. So I think like that's a cool part of it. And there's you become very capable to do a bunch of things by doing that. But yeah, those go hand in hand with like the downsides that are you're not going to be as good at any one thing. I don't think you can, I mean, right, like it would be silly to say like, oh, like the best runners in the world, like they really do like need to be like lifting 3 times a week just to be faster. And there may be a certain amount of strength training that's necessary for them, but in the case of like a very high volume triathlete, like you're training 40 hours a week, do you want to take out a few hours of that to get in some strength training and not have it negatively affect everything? Like they've decided not. Other people have decided that it is worth it to have a little bit lower training volume, but um, yeah, they're not doing it with the intention of actually being good at that thing. They're only doing it for the purpose of improving their primary like athletic event. So not going to be a specialist. It's also this depends how you train for it and how like aggressive you want to be with whatever you're doing. But uh, you do feel tired a lot. I feel like your legs are always sore from like lifting, and you might even be using you know like an eccentric focused leg session in order to facilitate muscle damage and like pre-fatigue your legs. That way, the next day you can do a longer run that wouldn't be as long as you might need to do if it were fresh. And immediately you're having to deal with some of the structural challenges of that and like maintaining your posture. And you're probably also dealing with some like substrate depletion in the legs. But but it does kind of suck because you're like already tired and your run's not going to be as good because you're just sore and like beat up right off the bat. And then I feel like that kind of lingers around all the time. So if you're training really hard for something as a hybrid athlete, I think you're going to feel like a little bit tired all the time. And I'm just like a tired person and I'm like really lazy, so it's hard for me to like actually deal with that. So that's kind of why I have these like short spurts of like go all out for a few months or a year or whatever, and then like I need to do something different for a little bit. Um, so yeah, I don't know if I have any other like clear like, oh, this is the downside of doing it. Besides, yeah, it's time consuming, it's tiring, and you're not going to be a specialist.
Yeah, I agree about the tired thing especially. I sleep great every night. I sleep really well. Particularly because I'm just always tired. So that works out well. So I don't worry about like my sleep quality or anything like that. So
I actually started getting really bad insomnia after my last deployment, and it goes in waves, but and it hasn't been quite as bad real recently. But I mean, I struggle with that sometimes, and it would get to the point where I'd over the course of months, like 4 hours of sleep, and then I wake up for a bit, and then I go back to sleep, and then maybe I get like 2 hours of sleep, and then at some point, like sometimes it got to where I couldn't sleep at all through the whole night, and then maybe the next night I can only sleep 2 hours. Um, so I like love to sleep, and I really appreciate when I am able to sleep well, and I think like you should you should sleep a lot if you can. I wish I was a better sleeper. Um, but yeah, I'm sure I could be like a lot better if I just could like figure out the whole sleep problem.
yeah. Yeah, so all right, so I do have an extra question now that we're talking about this. Because it seems like you mentioned earlier that when you were in high school, you would do some pretty psychotic things where you wake up in the middle of the night, do like lunges
Okay.
and run and then go back to sleep and then run in the morning when you woke up. Um, so I'm assuming you're pretty intense. You push yourself quite a bit. So on those days where you can't go to sleep, do you train the next day and you're just like, I just got to get through it? Or do you listen to your body and you're like, I couldn't sleep last night, so I'm going to have to auto regulate?
Yeah, so I think Buds was very humbling, and then being in the SEAL teams was very humbling because I struggled a lot for the first year out of team. Did well the last couple of years though, so ended on a positive note. But it still is very humbling, and I definitely don't feel like I'm anywhere near as like crazy about training as I used to be 10, 15 years ago. Um, and it used to be the case that like, yeah, I probably do the training no matter what. If I am in like a decent sleeping rhythm, like if I know I have to be up in like 6 hours or something, I'm not gonna cut that to train. But you can get fitter while not sleeping, but you can't get fitter if you don't train. So, maybe in the very short term, there is some flexibility there in sacrificing sleep, but if it's going to be a long-term thing, like I love when I can sleep well, so I'm not gonna cut into that and feel tired, and I'm also just like not as tough as I used to be because I don't have the same insecurity.
Yeah, yeah, it's yeah, and as you get older too, it's kind of like you start looking at life a little differently, I think. Where I'm assuming like you were more had a competitive mindset back then. At least for me, I'll speak for myself. Like I had a more competitive mindset where it's like I want to be really good at these things, and now it's like as I approach the age of 30, well now 31, um,
Oh,
I
we're like
start look.
almost the same age.
Oh, really? Yeah,
Yeah, well,
yeah.
I turned 31 in August.
Okay, yeah, I turned 31 in a month, so
Sweet,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, now I'm looking at a lot of my things a little differently where it's like, decently strong is good as long as I'm healthy and I feel good. I'll
Yeah.
run a decent mileage and as if my body feels good. Like I'm starting to slowly give up that idea that I'm going to be like
really elite in something because it's like the time has passed, it's gone. I just need to be healthy.
Yeah, I can't wait for this race to be over because I really just want to get to like, you know, spending an hour to an hour and a half in the gym or doing something else like 5 days a week instead of like, 7 days a week and just trying to squeeze in something like at every little rest that I have.
Yeah. I
It's
stress
pretty
that about
draining.
that. It is. It's more mentally draining because like I'll look at my schedule for let's say like the following day before I go to bed. I look
Uh,
at my schedule and I'm like, okay, I have a meeting here, I have class here. I go to the lab and then I'll have an hour in this block. If I bring my shoes and clothes with me to the lab, I can run out the door, do a quick 30-minute run, come back, have time to shower for like 5 minutes and make it to my next commitment. And it's just like finding those little blocks throughout the day. And like if anything goes wrong, it's like, crap, I lost that opportunity. So
yeah,
it
and that's
gets,
actually like the case with like hybrid training, or concurrent training in any sense. People do get sometimes, or it seems like maybe previously they used to, or my perception of what's going on is just wrong. But it seems like there's a little bit too much concern around like the physiological interference effect between like different like training stimuli. But I I don't think that's anywhere near as important as being able to figure out a way to do the work in the highest quality way. So like really easy example to think about that is like, would you rather max deadlift and then do like a 10-mile run, or would you rather do a 10-mile run and then a max deadlift? And like one of those is probably going to lead to like a better overall performance outcome. Also depends what you're training for, but um, yeah, I don't think like the order of things is like I don't think any of that is as important as people make it out to be unless you're like really trying to be the best of the best, which I don't think people who are hybrid training are doing that because they probably picked that because they weren't going to be the best of the best at any
yeah,
one thing. But I think the most important thing is just figuring out a way to like actually do the work, and that should be the primary focus. And for most people, I think it just doesn't need to be overthought.
yeah. I really like that you emphasize that just because people look at the details versus the whole picture thing. And like you mentioned, unless you're trying to be elite, where you have to look at the small things that's going to bring you up 0.5%, you know,
Mm,
other than that, like if you're not at that level, then it's like just do what you can, be consistent at it, and you'll get better over time. But if you're at the elite level where you have to look at everything, like every little detail, okay, then that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, I totally agree.
All right. So, if someone is wants to pick your brain a little bit more and wants to reach out, where can they find you?
Um, so my school email is blints BLINTS at email.sc.edu, for South Carolina. And then on Instagram I'm blankets. It's spelled like blanket, but with the spelling of my first name, so BLAINEKETS. And I think I'm very happy to put in time or like give attention to people asking like intelligent questions about stuff, and if they're well thought out, and I might even be excited to just chat with random people who ask about that stuff. But um yeah, either of those work, and I think I'm pretty good about like responding to stuff.
Thank you so much for your time. It was really great chatting with you, picking your brain a little bit more, and also hearing your pretty awesome backstory.
Thank you.